This is Liberalism in Question. My name is Rob Forsyth. Welcome. My guest today is Aidan Morrison, who is the lead of the newly set up energy department or energy program here at the Centre for Independent Studies. Welcome, Aidan.
Thanks very much for having me, Rob.
Before we ask you about climate change and classical liberalism, which is our topic today, what did you do before you came to the CIS?
It's a good question. I was working in data science and writing software for trading, actually, at the time. So the last 6 or 7 years, I've been a data scientist, full time. But before that, my original training was in physics. So I started with a physics degree, rapidly fell into being an entrepreneur in a range of different areas. And so my first project was actually in defence technology. I left my PhD in particle physics unfinished to go and start a defence tech startup. And then ended up falling into hospitality, and I've owned a bar restaurant with a few friends in my neighbourhood for a number of years, and then moved into a bit of, learnt to code doing some economics, and then started another startup in data science. And
here you are.
And here I am, a long kind of eclectic journey that's led to this point.
And you're researching some of the issues in the energy transition that we're going to decarbonise our economy. I want to come right back to the very beginning. The first question is this. Is there a problem with climate change? Is it a real thing, and are human beings contributing to it?
That's a very, very good question, Rob. I think there's a problem. I do think there's a problem. I would qualify that though. When I know for sure something and I have dived down to understand it in its deepest details, I'm very, very confident and swing with very combative positions and high confidence. And I haven't, like many people, dived deep into the science on climate change and tried to map out my assessment of all the different mechanisms and how it's worked. So I rely, like most people, on sort of on trusting those in public spaces to say what I think is the assessment, the net assessment of that. But I'll make a couple of qualifications about that. I think that there is a problem because there's a hugely increased risk, I suppose, in the future climate when there's going to be large changes to the atmosphere. I don't think it's the only problem that human beings face, and I think there's a tendency at times for us to try to paint this problem as though it is so catastrophic that we should almost forget about all the other problems that society faces and solve singularly for this problem. And I think that that's not a smart approach to take in general, even if the problem is very serious.
I can see a tunnel vision means you could unwittingly do damage to other things if you're just doing one thing at a time.
I think that's the case, and not only do you miss other things that you should be focusing on, but I think it makes you less coordinated and coherent in aiming for your actual goal, that you can oversee critical mistakes in how you would prosecute the goal that you're focusing on.
Is the solution significant reduction of greenhouse gases? Carbon dioxide, methane, and so forth.
That's another good question, which is I think that everyone will want to say that has to be the solution. I think that is the most likely solution for sure. But again, just wanting to own my own uncertainty in this, it's a very complex system, and I think that it's a very clear mechanism that carbon does increase the greenhouse effect, which is more complex than most people actually think it is, but that mechanism seems extremely credible, that we are contributing to the increase in temperatures, and I think that it would be very, very strange for us to think we can exponentially increase our carbon emissions into the future and not expect that to have a consequence. And so I think that we have to consider all the solutions and mitigation strategies.
And the greenhouse effect effectively is a metaphor of a greenhouse made of glass, where you trap the sun's rays within the heat within the building, and that's effectively what. I know it's more complicated than I can think of.
It's a lot more complicated than that. Actually,
everything's more complicated than what I can think of.
Yes.
But it's effectively, in some sense, increasing the energy available on Earth, the heat in particular, through what's in the atmosphere.
It is a lot more complicated than that, and I haven't studied it. In fact, I remember hearing descriptions of this from other good podcasters, and they kind of walk through the three layers of you think it's like this, and actually it's not true. And that's my experience of studying science, is when you study in first year, they tell you one thing, and the next year they tell you, actually, we told you that, but it's not really like that. It's another thing like that. So the greenhouse effect is is a little more complicated than that, but I do believe, and I think it's very, very, very widely accepted that it does exist and that carbon does contribute
and
to
that therefore
temperature
we should, despite the great benefits we've received, I mean, industrialisation has been astounding,
Yes.
astounding good for human beings. This is a downside that needs to be mitigated.
It needs to be mitigated. Yes, I think that's a good way of putting it, because it does increase the risks of the climate changing in a seriously bad way. There's a big spread of those possible outcomes. I think that serious science acknowledges that there's a diversity. We don't know for sure exactly what will happen in exactly which part of the climate, but we do know that a lot of the projections look very, very scary. Some of them look somewhere in between. Some people argue there's other feedback effects that might mitigate the effect. We'll start absorbing more carbon out through the plants in the biosphere. I haven't tried to dive into which ones of those are the most substantial, but I think trying to reduce our total carbon emissions is an obvious thing to try to do, to try to reduce the risk that we negatively impact the future climate.
My guest, by the way, is Aidan Morrison, who is in charge of the energy program here at the Centre for Independent Studies. Aidan, I'm impressed by the way in which you are bringing such nuanced answers to questions that so often seem to be presented to us in very simple language, black and white language, about what is and isn't the case. I suppose this is partly because people are concerned that human beings will need to pay a cost for the change, and therefore they want to convince human beings this is a real problem, and any attempt to bring nuance is often regarded as somehow chickening out for that question. The phrase climate change denier, for example, that kind of stuff.
That's right. Yep.
Do you want to comment as someone who's interested in precision and in clarity, comment on the sort of way this debate has become a culture wars debate?
Yes.
And the way in which only one sort of answer is seen to be the right answer, rather than possible different answers.
Yeah, that's a really good observation, because I think that to an extent, I think things like what is the role of science has been misconstrued in this, because in true science, it's necessary that there is a contest of ideas to focus in on trying to figure out which things are well supported by evidence, and then whittling them down to kind of say that this has become sort of certain truth. And you can't shortchange the contest of ideas stage and allowing new propositions to be entered and narratives to be questioned. So I think that, for example, the true state of the science is that there is a range of projected outcomes that, because it's a very big complex system.
Yes.
The greenhouse effect, it absolutely exists. There's a lot of other effects going on in our atmosphere, in our biosphere, in our oceans as well. And so whilst I think there's still very clear evidence that in recent history, that's been the dominant thing, to be able to question it or say, here's some contrary evidence, or this wasn't working the same way we said it was a few years ago, is an important part of, I think of democracy, of liberal thought, to be able to continually question and continually refine, and importantly, admit when you think something was wrong, has been said. And so, yeah, I think that to the extent that now even questioning, even updating what your assumptions are, is sort of seem to be put you into a basket where you're a denier of something that must be taken as absolute truth. Where I think that the truth that actually, when people use that phrase denier, is not a simple kind of fact as what most people believe it is.
In fact, my own observation is that the case for action on climate change has been damaged by inappropriate remarks or predictions, catastrophic predictions, that now expose those who make predictions to ridicule. The dams in Sydney would never have rain again. This was told by a person many years ago, and now it's just a gift to those who think it's all rubbish, because overconfident predictions almost always are going to be wrong, I believe. And therefore, in fact, the best case for proper action would be the case based upon a more nuanced understanding of the problem rather than a sloganising understanding.
I think that's right. Yeah. So I think that we've slipped into a space where I suppose a believer or a kind of acceptor of climate science must be convinced of the most imminent and catastrophic version of the outworking of the events, and the very, very tightest link to carbon dioxide only and man-made carbon dioxide emissions. So So I think that that is a problem where the link has been drawn to sort of make it such that you're assumed to have accept what is actually not necessarily extreme. It's still plausible, but one end of the sort of spectrum of kind of scientific beliefs. And I think that accepting that there is a risk and there is a spread of unknowns that we have to account for means that we have to be very serious about how we talk about what the costs
Aidan,
are.
you're not that happy with a phrase like "the science is settled." That's not a phrase you would like.
I don't think I'm comfortable with "the science is settled." No, I think it's for a system like the Earth. I mean, the science can be settled on a number of things.
Yes.
And I think that that science and various parts of the of climate science is well settled. The existence of the mechanism of the greenhouse gas is very well settled. But the question of are we sure that that's what's led to all of what's happened in the recent history? I think there's diversity of opinion there, and I'm happy to say that generally I assume that the consensus position is still credible on most of those things. But I think that we have to accept that there is still going to be a debate about these things, and it's not a debate that I've dived into, but I think that this area, trying to say that the science is settled, is asking people to commit to something that's really a particular position.
Now, you say you've not dived into it, and you're a guy who likes diving into this sort of stuff.
That's right.
The most nerdy person here at the Scientific Studies, in my view.
Oh, really?
Yes, I'm afraid so. But for people like myself, have a science background that is in high school, but not since then, we feel often a bit lost when we hear one person saying this is definitely the case, another saying this is definitely the case, and you feel somewhat not just frustrated but angry at the fact that why aren't we hearing what is the case in a way that is talking to each other, and therefore we lay people at this point can know where we're going.
That's right, and I think the sort of the vehement rejection of the others is. It's dislocating for lay people to listen in because it feels like you have to kind of accept some tribal identity in that debate when it's conducted that way, and I think that's a real problem. And I will say as well though that it's in terms of damaging the narrative for kind of pursuing serious climate action. I've been unsettled when I have found things that are repeated as though they are true with very, very high confidence, and when I have dived into them very deeply, particularly around the costs of renewables, they're demonstrably untrue. And I've been very clear and outspoken and direct on those things where I've dived into. But it's unsettled me to hear voices repeating with such confidence and such vehemence almost at times things which turn out to be untrue. Because I think it damages, the credibility of those that are often also speaking about what I think is still, a very credible scientific position.
And you said earlier, and I think you're right, that a liberal society, in the broader sense, is one in which allows the contesting of ideas, and it's liberal in not just its economic freedom as far as possible, human freedom consistent with responsibilities, but also intellectual freedom.
I think it's crucial.
And that. Yes, so there is actually a liberal issue here, a liberalism in question issue here in climate change, the way it's being dealt with.
I think so, and there's an economic aspect to that, but I think that the liberal approach to ideas and allowing ideas to be discussed openly and tested in a pluralistic way where they can be held and debated, I think is crucial even before you get to the kind of economic liberalism. Yeah,
I suspect for many people they feel so anxious about the problem of climate change and the urgency of action, they'd regard too much discussion as sitting on the Titanic discussing the iceberg, when the goal is to get the boats out. In other words, haven't got time for the luxury of having this conversation. We must act. That, I think, is the way many people approach it. Or others denying this, saying this is complete hysteria. It's all a lot of rubbish. That's where you get, I think, the illiberal character of the debate.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about what to do about it. There is a problem. We should do something about it.
Yeah.
Okay. What should we do about it? Now that's not easy, is it? Knowing you'll say it's not simple.
No, it's not simple. It's not simple, and it's not easy. I think that it's very, very difficult. So please continue. What do you want to know?
Well, as I understand it, the Industrial Revolution from the early 18th century, certainly, 18th century, has remarkably depended upon cheap energy. The discovery of coal, steam, petrol, gasoline, it's been remarkable. The fact that human beings find a force of energy that was so energy dense, and our whole culture is dependent upon it, right?
Yeah.
Now we've discovered that there's a unfortunate side effect, which if undealt with, could be very seriously damaging. So we've got to somehow rebuild, without losing the benefits of our industrialisation, rebuild on the run our whole system.
Our energy system.
Is that right?
That's the challenge.
Yep.
If we want to reduce dramatically, like radically, our carbon emissions, then our energy system will have to be
radically changed.
Radically changed, absolutely. Yeah.
And our systems have been built up depending upon a certain form of energy.
That's right.
And now we're going to do something very different. Let me talk about that. What is the role of government in all this? Again, classical liberals tend to favour, as far as possible, human decision making, not free from government completely, within government guidelines and protection, but what we call the market. People make decisions. This seems to be an area where the governments all around the world are very significantly involved. Is this a good thing, and why is it happening?
That's a very good question. I suppose it's worth reflecting just on the role of government in general, and I think that we're at the Centre for Independent Studies. I think that trying to conceive of a relatively small role of the government as ideal is a good thing. Monopoly on the use of force is the first requirement of government, which is law and order and protection from foreign threats. But in terms of like how to develop a thriving society as well within that, I think it's broadly accepted in Australia that the government also provides certain needs that seem to be not well provided, consistently at least, by people following their own completely free intuitions in a totally free market. And there's a number of areas where I think that the right way to approach that is to first ask whether the market and free individual action doesn't work. Justify to yourself why that doesn't work, and then we'd call that something like a market failure. And I think there is a need in those cases for the government to intervene to ensure that things that wouldn't otherwise be provided, or provided consistently enough that we would assume that all people are provided for,
because
are met.
One of the problems of the present situation, as I understand it, is that the consequences are still unexperienced. I know people talk about floods and droughts, and that may or may not be involved, but it's nothing like what may happen if climate change is unchecked.
Yes.
But the goods of the present situation are immediate, and therefore it's very hard to ask somebody interested in building their business now to spend money or spend capital on things that are not yet here.
That's right.
And therefore you're not getting the feedback mechanism you're normally getting in a free market situation.
That's right, yeah.
So and that's why someone's got to set a framework and say, we're going to somehow price in, or do some way of pricing in, the externalities, to use the phrase of the economist.
That's right.
That only the government can do that.
I think that's true.
Sadly.
Pricing in externalities is a thing that governments are expected to do, because it's a type of failure. When you say to someone, okay, this business can make money by digging up this mineral out of this valley, that's great. But if the consequences of that are externalised, as in the pollution runs downstream to someone else, that's a problem. And so you have to have the government basically enforce the rules to show that that's accounted for. So in this case, it's well established that the negative consequences of the carbon emissions are not immediately captured.
No.
It's captured downstream, and we have to figure out a way of doing that. Unfortunately, though, exactly the problem you're describing is that when you try to crystallise that cost and make it a very certain, clear cost that people face right now, the degree of cost that people are willing to sustain to trade off this kind of future, distant, somewhat unknown consequence of their actions is relatively small. And in my mind, that makes it doubly important for us to be very, very careful about us spending every effort in the most effective way possible, because it seems clear that we cannot justify any amount of cost to the current population. So we have to be sparing and efficient and focused and targeted in the way we focus our efforts.
I see your point. It's true. I think that I gather people in theory are very much in favour of action, but when it comes down to actually costing me now more money
That's right.
for that,
That's right.
or can't do that, then I suddenly I go right down to what I'm prepared to pay. That's your point.
That's right. I mean, when you ask people whether they care about climate change, the vast majority absolutely do.
Yep.
And I think that's good and right. But when you ask them to trade off other things and other prices and qualities of their life or their budget, the trade-off becomes rapidly much smaller. As I said before, it is a problem. It's not the only problem. And we have to respect that in the population to win the license to do something.
I often hear around the place the implication from government spokespeople anyway that there's no cost. I don't know if you heard this. The notion that
I have heard this.
That
that's
basically this is really not going to cost us anything, and in fact, it'll make us better.
That's right. Yep.
And then the government's got to enforce people to do it because that argument has not meant the market says, great, let's do it.
Yes.
Do you comment on the "it won't cost you anything" argument?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is I think a perfect fallacy, and it's unfortunately a fallacy that's still being promoted quite openly by the current government in Australia. The idea that pushing more renewables into the system is what lowers the costs of the energy system, more wind and solar in particular. Hydro is a bit of a different story, but the idea that there is no debate to be had and no serious cost because this system is cheaper as well, I think that's deluding ourselves. I think that's having a dishonest approach to this, and it's not engaging in the mature conversation we should be having, which is, what will it cost? And if we're going to spend something, how do we spend it just the best way and make sure the costs are as best distributed across the society and the expenditure is best spent to get the best
In fact,
outcome.
your work, as I understand it here, is focusing on this particular issue of what is the best transition to a low-carbon future and what are the real costs of the various options. This is your shtick.
That's absolutely our shtick. And at the moment, I think where the most egregious errors and misrepresentations have been made is trying to present this idea that there's no debate to be had because rushing towards renewables is also pushing down power prices. And I think that's very much our focus because we have to be serious about the costs so we can spend our budget wisely and we can get the mandate from the population to be able to spend the money.
I mean, you're saying that the present narrative is false about cost nothing, or even better still.
Yes, it's saving us money. Yeah, that's right.
But you're not raising this problem because you want to stop action.
No.
It's because you're not subtly sneaking in climate denialism here.
No, that's right. And there's a distinction though, but I'd also qualify though, because you said not stop action. There could be actions we're doing which are actually in the wrong direction.
Oh yes, I meant stop action in
right.
global.
No, that's right. Yeah, globally, I'm not saying that we shouldn't still be doing something.
So it could be. So it's your belief that the present Australian situation in particular,
that's right,
which I think is, in theory, I'm not entirely clear because the question of where gas fits in is still floating around, if I could excuse the pun. But the notion is that we can do this one here entirely on renewables.
Yes.
Which means basically wind and solar with a bit of, as you say, water thrown in. That's the claim.
Yep.
You don't believe that?
Oh, I don't think it's going to be anything like the lowest cost way of transitioning to a low carbon economy. That's my claim, and I would say this, Rob. The idea that because we have lots and lots of space and lots of land where there's lots of wind and lots of sun. I mean, the argument that makes it cheapest for us, it's akin to arguing that we should definitely not farm any pork or cattle or sheep because we have so much kangaroo and buffalo and goat out there in the landscape. We've got so much landscape. And this is true, by the way. We could feed Australia and probably half of Asia if all the kind of wild animals and stock out there was somehow able to get to our plates for free.
Feral food.
Feral food, right? And so, but unfortunately, the cost of getting things quickly, efficiently, at the right times and volumes and qualities to our plates means that it's still worthwhile to produce food in a controlled environment. And I think it's the same is true of energy, is that we just need to be able to own that fact. It's not just the fact that fossil fuels were low cost. We could control them. They could be moved and commanded and burnt in a place and at a time we needed them. And that makes them very, very useful for the Industrial Revolution and for raising our living standards. So it's the uncontrollability, the dispersedness of the renewables across our continent. In total aggregate amount, of course they're abundant, but at the particular high quality, controllable stream that we require for our society, that abundance spread out across our continent doesn't amount to very much.
Is this where the notion of energy density comes? Is that the phrase you use?
It's exactly where energy density comes in, because we're able to get energy from something that's small enough that we can capture it and control it, and say. And the phrase that I like is something from Napoleon, a quote attributed to Napoleon before the age of steam. He said to someone, "Do you propose to me that we should light a bonfire under the deck of the ship to make it sail against the wind?" Ridiculing the idea of that, but that is exactly what the miracle of fossil fuels is, that you could light the bonfire and it's in your ship, and you could make it sail against the wind.
Who knew that Napoleon was a fossil fuel denier? You are right. I mean, I'm thinking in particular of aeroplanes.
That's right.
Where the energy density is crucial, because weight is so important. And at present, I don't think we know of a technology that can replace hydrocarbon fuel. It's just so darn dense, powerful. For example,
that's exactly right. And an aircraft are one, because lithium-ion batteries, they're just an order of magnitude too heavy. So it won't work for any serious distance. So that's an easy example there.
So you're saying you think there is enough? Well, ask you: is there enough energy coming into Australia from sun and wind? Not that imagine we could capture it all enough, or is it still not enough?
Oh no, Australia has enough energy in sun.
Okay, that's all right.
In total, but the question is the capturing. And so, just like we have so much kangaroo and wild goat and buffalo out there, but the proposal to say, well, can we catch it? Can we get that to our dinner plates?
That's the key issue. Yep. The key issue. So, do you think, therefore, you do believe, I understand, that the renewal path is much more expensive than people are saying?
That's right.
Much more expensive.
Yep.
Do you think it actually would even work?
Would it work
you make
physically?
It work? Is it going to work? Is the engineering going to work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And every time I dive deeper into this, I encounter new engineers and scientists in this space that have a different reason I haven't heard of why the practical actually making it work thing might not work. I'll tell you what, I'm still relatively techno-optimistic, where I would say that if you have a value proposition high enough, and you're willing to pay a price high enough, I think most of the technical, physical problems could be solved at some cost. But the cost we need to be very serious about. And by the way, lots of serious engineers tell me, we really don't know that wouldn't work, and this would lead to that. But there are. I like to think that at some cost we can solve all these problems. We can pull it off. But we have to be clear about what that cost, and we could be terribly out of whack on that cost.
And therefore the danger is you spend far much more than you needed.
Yes.
And of course, by doing that, you're not spending it on something else.
That's exactly right.
The opportunity cost.
Yes.
And therefore you could be impoverishing yourself in other ways that weren't needed. And that would be a big mistake.
That's a huge mistake. And it could be slightly worse than that again. Oh. Again, I would say that imagine the person with somewhat tunnel vision, singularly focused on objective, and they are stumbling because they're too focused on that objective, because they're not considering other obstacles in their way. And the sorts of examples I'd give you is thinking about what you're doing in the short term to try to rush your transition, and things like clearing large areas of land, of remnant forest that hasn't been cleared before. And for example, that actually has a carbon consequence. If you care about carbon emissions,
ironic.
The clearing of land does have a consequence. And I know that, and actually in all our modelling at the moment, we don't generally assume a given amount of old forest that you have to clear for a wind farm. But that's left out of our models, unfortunately.
It's one of these
in Australia, we leave out all the concrete in the basin, still in the basin. So the question is what short-term investments you make in terms of emitting more? What higher levels of investments? What damage will you do in the environment in the short term, in order to expedite a very short-term reduction when you haven't necessarily got a vision for a long-term sustainable solution?
There are some areas where I don't think we have the technology yet, if I'm not mistaken. I think the question of significant flight, I don't know about heavy transport.
I think that's right. I mean, in flight, the current hope is that we'll be able to use some kind of synthetic e-fuel, something like ammonia. But I think all of these things have not just problems, but really hard problems that we know won't be kind of solved by a momentary sort of, snap of the fingers. They're
not costless.
That's right.
Now, in Australia, more recently, and I'm rather personally pleased to see this is on the table again, the question of nuclear power has returned.
Yes.
Now, am I right that around the world, where nations are trying very seriously to deal with this problem, and not all are. There are many deniers out there. Nuclear is playing an increasing role. Is it coming back to play a role in this transition?
I think it is, massively. Huge number of countries in the world do have nuclear, and I think that those countries that are trying to move in the other direction and remove their nuclear, they're conducting an experiment that the rest of the world is watching, and I'm thinking of Germany in particular, and particularly painful deindustrializing to an extent, basically, as a consequence of their high power prices. So I think that most of the world is very alive to the idea that nuclear is a really important part of this transition, because it's a few orders of magnitude denser again than fossil fuels, which means that the volumes of material you have to move and mine and process for it are extremely small. And it means that it's really an ideal replacement for coal, which is the kind of current heavy lifting, static baseload power for so much of our electricity generation. So I think most of the world is totally alive to nuclear at the moment, and I think that Australia's a little bit an outlier in insisting we should keep it banned.
It is ridiculous, and I'm appalled that it was the Howard government that did this. It really, talk about short-term thinking.
Horse trading to get other objectives across the line.
You're a good example of short-term gain to long-term loss.
Yeah.
It's often said, and it's clear to me, that there's massive capital costs in nuclear.
That's right.
And you've done some research on how to make it the cheapest you can get.
Yes.
And the cheapest you can get, I think, if I'm not mistaken, involves not trying too many different versions, but just sticking to a model that really works.
Yes.
And secondly, serious government leadership in the area.
Yeah.
Now, this is rather a bit of tension with that for the point of view of the Senate, from a Liberal point of view, a Liberal Democratic point of view, because we think that the government should not play a heavy role, but you think here they should play a heavy role.
Yeah, that's right. I think,
why?
Why would I think such a thing? I think that as you pointed out, you end up in a position where the best version of nuclear, because it's so capital intensive, you have to learn the lessons of repeating more or less a single design at a particular place, and the investments required to make that work are at a very high scale. And also, I think that it's difficult for the free market to be able to amass and make that sort of long-term decision where it's going to be potentially 80 or 100 years before the full asset cycle is worthwhile, or has kind of finished up. So it's hard to imagine the free market being able to say we're going to spend not $1 or $2 billion, but maybe $40 or $50 billion on a 100-year investment in a particular place. And also, once you've done that, there's an extent to which you have kind of picked winners in terms of, like, you've chosen a particular design, so you're not really proposing to have a lot of competition. So the scope for competition, to have lots of players in the market saying, I've got a better nuclear reactor next year, no, I'll swap out mine now. Those competitive forces are seriously weakened in this kind of scale. So you have to be honest about how much competition you have left. And I think the government in this case, in energy systems around the world, and other energy systems too, they can justify greater involvement.
And this is because, as you put it, long time scales,
very long time scales,
and massive capital costs.
That's right. Yeah.
Initially,
yes.
To will it eventually pay for itself? Will it eventually be worth it?
Oh, I'm very confident that's the case. Yeah, absolutely. In the United States at the moment, the nuclear reactors they built in the 70s are currently being relicensed to run for extra 20-year extensions up to about 80 years. So, and we're building them. Every decade that passes, we raise the standards. One of the consequences of raising the standards higher and higher and higher is making it safer and safer, more geologically stable. They're built to such a high quality. Lasting a long time is one of those kind of beautiful side effects.
So maybe being a laggard's got some upside.
Being a laggard.
You buy the latest model. Right?
Oh, well, no, but the thing is that actually I disagree with that, because the ones that we had, except in the Soviet Union, there was a real problem with the one with that design at Chernobyl, but most of the ones we built for most of history are actually totally safe. And we don't need to get to the very, very latest cutting edge to have good nuclear power. There's an extent to which us hoping that there's some future breakthrough that makes it slightly better again. The reality is that those reactors built in the last few decades are actually quite good.
Do you think fusion reactors are going to be a possibility?
Absolutely not. No.
This is explained. A fission reactor breaks up atoms.
That's right.
And the extra energy, incredible power just from that. Fusion is making atoms join together.
That's right.
Helium out of hydrogen. Some said this is the golden, this is the great solution to all our problems. No?
Absolutely not. No, if I was to live 1,000 years, I'd sell my house to short fusion for the next 200 or 300 at least. There's just no chance that it will ever be better than fission. And the reason I say that is that it doesn't solve any problems that fission actually have. Fission doesn't have a waste problem. It will always be more expensive to build a fusion reactor, and that's for a few critical reasons. You know, you're taking the densest metal we know and getting that to produce energy locally and have totally metal waste. In a fusion reactor, you're trying to get the least dense thing we know and hold it into a space that's at almost light speed, so it collides together without touching it. It has to be in a vacuum, so you're doing it with the crazy magnetic fields, and the energy comes out as neutrons, and catching neutrons, although this is probably too nerdy, cut me off when you need to.
It's high on the nerd.
Is extremely hard to do. So there are very, very fundamental ways in which these are not problems that you can just easily invent your way around. They're fundamental reasons why fusion will always be harder, more complex, more tricky than fission. And fission, it doesn't solve any problems that fission has. Fission doesn't have problems that need solving. It's the ultimate kind of ideal energy system.
Thank you for the conversation. As we draw it in, I want to ask this question. You've approached this matter technically. You've approached the matter as an engineer or a scientist would. The cost benefit, nuclear versus non-nuclear. In our society, it seems to me, many of these technical engineering issues have become cultural issues. Can you explain that to me?
No, I can't. I think it's very sad that these questions about what is the best, what energy system will be cheapest, they should be technical questions, and it's very strange now that we've got a debate where you're treated as a denier and an outcast for questioning the technical conclusions that led to a particular outcome there in the narrative. So it saddens me. I think that we need to be able to have technical debates, and we're at a point now where we almost can't. And no, I can't explain it. I wish I could.
There's a thing called reality, which always mugs you at the end, it seems to me. One way or another, this issue is going to be resolved.
Yes.
May not be. Well, you're going to live 1,000 years, so in your case, I'm not. It could go bad if it's badly handled.
That's right. Yes.
And that's your worry.
Well, I think at the moment we are risking basically burning the political capital we have and the trust of the population by telling them basically lies about what the cost will be to try to kind of slip it in sideways, a very poorly designed energy transition. And I think that might burn all the political capital we have to take climate change seriously and think about addressing with cost-appropriate, seriously focused solutions to try to mitigate that risk in the future. So that's what I think we're in danger of doing, is that we're burning the political capital we have to do something by pretending there's not a serious cost to what we're doing, and basically wasting the resources we've got the license to use.
Well, on that somewhat sober note, I want to thank you very much for your contribution. Very, very, very thought-provoking. This has been another in our Liberalism in Question series here at the Centre for Independent Studies. I'm Rob Forsyth. Thanks for watching.